Hi everyone, this is Miriam from Language Studio Euphema, and I'm glad you decided to watch my video about the second conditional. Well, let's see what you can find in here. First of all, I'm going to explain some basic stuff about the second conditional, how to form a sentence in the second conditional, in what situations to use it, okay, what the structure is. After that, we will look into some commonly made mistakes. In the third part, there will be practice, so you will translate some Slovak sentences into English using the second conditional to drill. And finally, the fourth part is the simu conversation, where I'll be asking you questions using second conditional, and you will answer so as to practice. Okay, so let's get started. Maybe you're asking why the name conditional. As a matter of fact, in English, we've got 4 conditionals. It's 0 conditional, first, second, and third conditional. Right now, we're learning about a second conditional, but no matter about which conditional you're talking, there is always this word if, and all of those conditional sentences express a condition, and that is why they are called conditionals, all right? So there's always a condition in Slovak podmienka, and they all use this short word if. Another thing they have in common, all those conditional structures or sentences, is that they consist of 2 parts, always 2 parts. There is this if clause, also called conditional clause, and the other one is the main clause. All right, so if clause, main clause, 2 parts in all conditional sentences. Okay, now let's get more specific and let's focus on the second conditional. When do we use it? Okay, we use the second conditional to talk about unreal or imaginary situations in the future. I don't know if you remember or if you've watched my previous video about the first conditional, but there I explained that with the first conditional, we are talking about the realistic future situations. While here, with the second conditional, you can see the contrast because now we are talking about unreal or imaginary situations in the future. So it means that they are very, very unlikely, very improbable to happen, okay? It's not possible, it's not probable that they will happen in the future, all right? So remember, unreal, imaginary situations in the future. Another thing to remember is that in the second conditional sentence, there is always this word if, but this time it does not mean the same as in the first conditional. We learned that in the first conditional it means ak. Now the meaning changes and the meaning of if is keby because it's imaginary. Okay, well, let's see the structure now. First one here in this example is if clause, and second one is main clause. So in the if clause, we always have to use the word if, and we have to follow with a past simple. The main clause is different because we have to use would and infinitive. This is the structure. For example, if I had a lot of money, I would travel around the USA. Okay, let's analyze that. First, there is if clause. So I have to use, of course, if and past simple. Past simple of have if is had. So if I had a lot of money, I would travel around the USA. This is the main clause where I use would and infinitive, which I did, would and infinitive, would travel around the USA. Why did I use the second conditional here? Well, it's an imaginary, unreal situation because if I had a lot of money, the truth is that I don't have a lot of money. I don't have enough to travel around the USA. It would be a really pricey, really expensive trip. So I just imagined it, okay? If I had a lot of money, I would travel around the USA. It's just my dream, okay? Now, if you want to sound more natural, you should use this contraction of I would, which is I'd. All right, so I can say I would travel around the USA, but to sound more natural, I should say rather I'd travel around the USA. I'd travel around the USA. So I'd is basically I would. If I had a lot of money, I'd travel around the USA. Another example, if I could travel in time, I'd go back to the 16th century. If I could travel in time, I'd go back to the 16th century. Again, I started with the if clause and continued with the main clause. In the if clause, I used if plus past simple. Past simple of can is could. And then in the main clause, I used would. Again, I used this contraction of I would, which is I'd. Yes, I'd plus infinitive, go. I'd go back to the 16th century. Question, is time travel possible? Is it realistic? Of course not. That's why I use the second conditional, okay? Imaginary situation, imaginary scenario. Yeah, if I could travel in time, I would go back to the 16th century, but unfortunately, it's not possible. Unfortunately or fortunately, I'm not sure, but certainly I would love to go back to that century if I could. All right, now maybe you're asking if this if clause must be always the first one in order. Well, the answer is no. You can start with the main clause. So it is possible to swap or to exchange the two clauses, all right? So it means that it is not a rule that a conditional sentence must start with if. What I did here is I swapped the two clauses from the previous example. Here I started with the if clause, if I could travel in time, and then main clause, I'd go back to the 16th century. But we can swap them and we can start with the main clause. So I'd go back to the 16th century if I could travel in time. So first one is main clause, second one is if clause. It's completely correct and all right. You can choose what you want to start with. Swapped structure, we start with a main clause, not with the if clause, but main clause, where we have to put would and infinitive. And if clause is the second one, where we have to put if and past simple. Regarding punctuation, there is exactly the same rule as in the first conditional. So do not put a comma in Slovak čiarka before the word if. See, in these two examples, if I could travel in time, I'd go back to the 16th century. I started with the if clause and continued with the main clause. In this case, we separate if clause from the main clause by a comma. Okay, so if clause, comma, main clause. However, if you choose to start with the main clause, I'd go back to the 16th century. There is no comma before if I could travel in time. So if we start with the main clause, there is no comma separating the main clause from the if clause. In one word, there is no comma before if. That's the rule you should remember. Do not put a comma before the word if. And now, a very special chapter about the verb be in an if clause. Okay, let me ask you one question. Have you ever heard any of these? If I were you, or if I were in your place, or if I were in your shoes. Well, I bet that you've heard that, I don't know, on TV or on the radio, in some song. You know, English is everywhere. I believe that you have heard one of those. And maybe you have even wondered why there is were after the pronoun I. Normally, I use was after I, right? I was, for example, I was at home. I was scared. I was in the shop. Okay? So normally I put was after I. But here, if I were you, if I were in your place, I used were after I. And it is completely correct. Why? Because it's an exception for the second conditional. Well, the rule is that in the second conditional, after I, he, she, and it is preferable to use were and not was if we are talking about completely imaginary situations. All right? So not only can I use were after you, we, they, okay? If we were, if you were, but also after I, he, she, and it. It's completely correct. Well, let's see some examples here. If I were a man, I would try to pick up a girl in a bar. I'm not a man, I'm a woman, right? And I will always be a woman. So it's purely imaginary. That's why I used were after I, okay? So if I were a man, I would try to pick up a girl in a bar. Another example, if he were younger, he would get the job. If he were younger. Again, imaginary because he is not so young anymore, okay? So it is just an unreal situation that I just imagine in my head and I speculate what could happen. So if he were younger, he would get the job. Finally, if it were Friday now, I'd be out with friends. Is it Friday now? No, it's not. It's Tuesday, only Tuesday, and I am working. But if it were Friday, I'd be out with friends, drinking beer, maybe. So if I were, if he were, if it were, if she were, this is classic second conditional. Maybe you even know this song from Beyonce. She is singing, if I were a boy, I would turn off my phone. I think the lyrics go like that. And there you can see, you can check out the lyrics on the internet. She is singing, if I were a boy. Yeah, also an imaginary situation. She is imagining this. If I were a boy, I would do this or that. Yeah, so unreal situation in the future. And here is a little tip for the Slovak learners of English that could help you. Okay, now think about the second conditional and compare the English structure with the Slovak structure. If you do that, you'll realize that they are very similar. Just you have to remember that the word if means keby, so its meaning changes from ak in the first conditional to keby in the second conditional. Now, let's see. This is the English second conditional sentence. If we went by bus, we would save money. Now let's see the Slovak one and let's compare. Keby sme šli autobusom, ušetrili by sme peniaze. Okay, so we can see that we start with keby, if. We went. In Slovak, we also use past. Sme šli. Šli is the past of ísť. So if we went by bus, keby sme šli autobusom, same or very, very similar, right? We would save money. Ušetrili by sme peniaze. We could say that this word by in Slovak is basically would in English. It represents maybe this modal verb would. So whenever you want to use or you want to translate by, sme niečo robili, you can be sure that you have to use this modal verb would plus infinitive, okay, in this case. So ušetrili by sme, we would save money. Now you can try it. So try to translate this sentence. Keby som mal čas, navštívil by som ich. Keby som mal čas. Of course, you have to use if to start a sentence, plus past simple of have, which is had. And again, here we have be. I said that you have to use would and infinitive if you want to translate this one for the second conditional. So your sentence should sound like this. If I had the time, I'd visit them, or I would visit them. Okay? So Keby if mal past simple had, navštívil by som ich, I would visit them. Now, what are the most common mistakes that we make when we are forming a second conditional sentence? Mistake number 1, we put would in an if clause, which is wrong. The rule is that you should never put would after if in a second conditional sentence, at least not in standard second conditional sentences, okay? So let's see this example. Keby ma poprosil, pomohla by som mu. The wrong translation is, if he would ask me, I would help him. What's wrong here? Of course, the word would, because we learned that after if, in the if clause, we have to use only past simple. So the correct translation would be, if he asked me, I would help him. So here we can see that if clause with the word if, all right, and past simple. If he asked me. Main clause with would infinitive. I would help him. Mistake number 2 is an incorrect use of the word so. Okay, many Slovak learners of English make this mistake because they use the word so before the main clause. Such as in this example. Keby som žila v dome, tak by som mala psa. This word tak makes trouble, is a troublemaker, because some of us want to translate, every word for word. And that's why we are looking for some equivalent for the word tak. And wrongly sometimes we use this word so. Okay, so if I lived in a house, so I would have a dog. This is wrong. If you really need to use some equivalent, you can use one, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But first, I want to explain why this is wrong. This English word so means preto, okay? Another expression for so in English is therefore or that's why, okay? So a completely different meaning. Keby som žila v dome, preto by som mala psa. That just doesn't make sense, right? It's nonsense. So if you really need to use some equivalent, if you are really the kind of person who likes to translate everything word for word, then I have a solution for you. And it's this word then, not so. So in Slovak it would also make sense. Keby som žila v dome, potom by som mala psa. In English, if I lived in a house, then I would have a dog. It's completely correct, so you can use this alternative then. But, if I should give you a little tip, don't use anything there, okay? You just translate it simply. If I lived in a house, I would have a dog. That's it. No then, no so. Just, make it as simple as possible and as short as possible. Well, and here comes the practice part. Which is designed for the Slovak learners who will translate the second conditional clauses from Slovak into English. If you're not Slovak, please just go ahead and skip straight to the conversation part. So, here we go. Please translate the bits or the clauses. Keby som vyhral 1 milión eur, translate. If I won 1 million euros. So this is the if clause in which we have to use past simple. Past simple of win is won. Okay, let's continue with another if clause. Keby som videl UFO. If I saw a UFO, very well. Keby som hovoril po taliansky. If I spoke Italian, keby som mal auto. If I had a car, excellent. And now we'll continue with main clauses. Cestoval by som. I'd travel or I would travel. It's a main clause. That's why we have to use would plus infinitive, right? Next. Nepovedal by som to nikomu. I wouldn't tell anyone. Presťahoval by som sa do Ríma. I'd move to Rome. Nechodil by som autobusom. I wouldn't go by bus. So now we have complete sentences, right? If I won €1,000,000, I'd travel. If I saw a UFO, I wouldn't tell anyone. If I spoke Italian, I'd move to Rome. If I had a car, I wouldn't go by bus. Now let's swap the two clauses. And let's start with this one, with the main clause. Cestoval by som. Translate, please. I travel, very well. Nepovedal by som to nikomu. I wouldn't tell anyone. Presťahoval by som sa do Ríma. I'd move to Rome. Nechodil by som autobusom. I wouldn't go by bus, right? So all of them were main clauses. That's why we only used would and infinitive after that, right? And now let's continue with if clauses. Keby som vyhral €1,000,000. Translate. If I won €1,000,000, very well. Keby som videl UFO. If I saw a UFO, good. Keby som hovoril po taliansky. If I spoke Italian, keby som mal auto. If I had a car. Good. Let's continue. Again, let's start with if clauses. Keby som ho nepoznal. If I didn't know him. Keby som bol zviera. If I were an animal, you remember that the verb be in the second conditional is quite exceptional because we are allowed to use were universally after every person, after I, he, it, she, all persons basically, all right? So if I were an animal, good, let's continue. Keby bola tu. If she were here, again, the same rule applies. Keby si bol môj šéf, if you were my boss, see, were again. So after I, she, you, it's always were. Okay? Now let's continue with the main clauses. Veril by som mu. I'd believe him. Bol by som pes. I'd be a dog. Šli by sme na večeru. We'd go to dinner. Počúval by som ťa. I'd listen to you. Now, all sentences, if I didn't know him, I'd believe him. If I were an animal, I'd be a dog. If she were here, we'd go to dinner. If you were my boss, I'd listen to you. Now let's swap the clauses. Veril by som mu, so it's a main clause. Don't forget would plus infinitive. I'd believe him. Bol by som pes. I'd be a dog. Šli by sme na večeru. We'd go to dinner. Počúval by som ťa. I'd listen to you. And now, if clauses. Keby som ho nepoznal. I hope you use the past simple here. So if I didn't know him. Good. Keby som bol zviera. If I were an animal. Keby tu bola. If she were here. Keby si bol môj šéf. If you were my boss. All right, so I'd believe him if I didn't know him. I'd be a dog if I were an animal. We'd go to dinner if she were here. And I'd listen to you if you were my boss. Please notice that here we did not use any comma before if. Okay, we started a sentence with the main clause. And then the if clause followed, but as we learned before, we can never put comma before if, so there is no comma, okay? But if we compare it with the next set of sentences, you will see that there will be a sentence because we are starting now again with the if clause. Keby sme mali chatu, if we had a cottage, see, there is a comma here. Keby býval sám. If he lived alone. Keby som bol tebou. Notice there is this bol, so the verb be after if. If I were you. Very well. Keby som vedel lietať. If I could fly, well, and now main clauses, boli by sme tam teraz. We'd be there now. Bol by šťastnejší. He'd be happier. Odišiel by som. I'd leave. And letel by som do Grécka. I'd fly to Greece. So the whole complete sentences, if we had a cottage, we'd be there now. If he lived alone, he'd be happier. If I were you, I'd leave. If I could fly, I'd fly to Greece. Let's swap them and start with main clauses. Boli by sme tam teraz. We'd be there now. Bol by šťastnejší. He'd be happier. Odišiel by som. I'd leave. Letel by som do Grécka. I'd fly to Greece. And the if clauses. Keby sme mali chatu. If we had a cottage, keby býval sám. If he lived alone, keby som bol tebou. If I were you, keby som vedel lietať. If I could fly. Very well. Okay, so you see the whole sentences now. We'd be there now if we had a cottage. He'd be happier if he lived alone. I'd leave if I were you. And I'd fly to Greece if I could fly. All right, and finally, here we have complete sentences. Again, you're going to translate. Please concentrate on the structure that you're supposed to use in particular clauses. So, keby som hovoril po taliansky, presťahoval by som sa do Ríma. Translate, please. So if I spoke Italian, I'd move to Rome. Very well. Next. Keby som mal auto, nechodil by som autobusom. If I had a car, I wouldn't go by bus. Okay. Keby som bol zviera, bol by som pes. If I were an animal, I'd be a dog. And finally, keby býval sám, bol by šťastnejší. If he lived alone, he'd be happier. Very well. And finally, the last part of the video conversation in which I'm gonna ask questions. First of all, I'll answer them as model answers, and then I'll ask you and I'll leave you some space to answer them too, okay? Please, after each question, answer or give me the long answer, okay? So as to practice both if clause and main clause of the second conditional, all right? So the first question on the list, what would you do if you won €1,000,000? Nice. So, okay, if I won €1,000,000, I'd buy a cottage in the mountains in Slovakia. You see, in my free time, I love going hiking, so it would be wonderful if I could just, pack my stuff during the weekend and just go and hike and enjoy the nature. That would be great. So if I won €1,000,000, I'd definitely buy a cottage in the mountains. What about you? If you won €1,000,000, what would you buy? What would you do with it? Answer, please. Good. Okay, I hope that you remembered how to use second conditional. So after if, you put past simple in the if clause, and after or in the main clause, you put would infinitive, right? Well done. So the second question on the list. Would you tell anyone if you saw a UFO? Okay, if I saw a UFO, I wouldn't tell anyone, because I think that people in general are quite skeptical of this issue. Not everybody believes that there is a life, like extraterrestrial life. And if I said, oh, hey guys, I saw the UFO, people would probably think that I'm crazy. So I wouldn't tell anyone if I saw a UFO. Would you tell anyone if you saw a UFO? Good. Next question. If you were an animal, what animal would you be? Okay, this is a classic second conditional question, purely imaginary. And I have to answer that if I were an animal, I'd be a bird. And why? Because, I don't know, I've always admired this ability of birds to fly wherever they want, this freedom, right? In my dreams, I often, push off the ground and flap my arms, and suddenly I'm floating in the air. It's a wonderful feeling. So yes, if I were an animal, I'd be a bird. And you? If you were an animal, what animal would you be? And why? Okay, good. Let's continue. If you could fly, where would you fly? Okay, that's a little related to my previous answer. So yes, if I could fly, I would fly to some hot tropical country right now, because right now there is early spring here in Slovakia, and it's fine, I like it, but I'm rather a person who enjoys hot temperatures and this, this humid climate. So if I could fly, I would fly to some tropical country with a nice hot climate. Yeah, that's what I would do. What about you? So if you could fly, where would you fly? Excellent job. Next question. If you were invisible for one day, what would you do? Well, that's a pickle. A tough question. Well, if I were invisible for one day, I would probably go to some politicians' offices, you know, in the parliament or somewhere, and I would listen to what they are talking about. You know, I would like to know if they are for real, if the things that they say on TV or on the radio, if they really mean it or if they just fake it. So yes, if I were invisible for one day, I'd go to some politicians' offices and listen to their conversations. What about you? If you were invisible for one day, what would you do? Now I feel really sorry that I cannot hear your answers because I would be interested. And the last question on the list, what century would you travel to if you had a time machine? Yes. So if I had a time machine, I would travel to the 16th or 17th century, somewhere like that, because I don't know, I've always been fascinated by that period when there were kings and queens and they lived in those beautiful castles and the ladies used to wear this big puffy dresses, you know. It's just, I don't know, it's very, very fascinating for me, and I would like to experience the life in the maybe 16th, 17th century. I would like to see the life in the castles and people riding the horses and everything connected with it. So, what century would you travel to if you had a time machine? Go. All right. Well, so I guess that's it. This is the end of the video. I hope that you've learned some useful stuff about the second conditional, how to make it, the common mistakes, and some practice. You can get back to it whenever you want to. Okay, go through the sentences again, answer, practice, drill. It's right there for you. So thank you very much for your attention and tune us again. Bye-bye.